Welcome once again to this podcast series, our regular deep dive into the weird and wonderful world of strata, by corporate, management rights, the whole shebang. My name is Chris Irons and I am Director of StrataSolve. That's stratasolve.com.au. Alongside me, Frank Higginson, partner at Hines Legal, which is the premier provider of legal services to the strata and management rights industry in Queensland. Hello, Frank.
Hello, Chris. Hello, everyone. Again.
What's been
happening? I'm going to bamboozle you with something I didn't give you notice of.
All right, let's do
This is our 99th webinar.
Is it really?
Podcast. 99.
Is it really?
Yep, next one's 100.
Man.
That is 50 hours of us chatting about strata stuff, and we still haven't scratched the surface.
Time flies, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, wow. Okay. Look, that's pretty impressive, I think, isn't it?
Yep. So I suppose if you're new to it, what I'd say is you can scroll through our website for any one of those 50 hours and listen till your heart's content.
And Frank, the other thing I think it highlights, I agree with that. The other thing it highlights is that anybody who ever says, I just have a quick question, it'll take 3 minutes, the answer should be, well, actually, there's a minimum 50 hours of learning that you have to have about strata. There's no such thing as a quick answer.
No. So there you go. A little bit of excitement.
Oh, this is exciting. Yeah. Little bit of housekeeping. If you're listening in live on YouTube, you can post your questions in the chat. We'll get to those as best we can. If you're consuming this later, like while you're out walking the dog, as I will be no doubt soon, washing the dishes, he's getting a bit anxious, let me tell you. You can find all the notes and links that we refer to at hineslegal.com.au. So I think, Frank, we're continuing our profile of different building types this time around. So refresh me. I think we've done short-term rental buildings.
We have.
Your duplexes.
Yes. And this might be the third one.
It is. And important to refresh people on why we're doing it. In order to get the outcomes that you want in strata, you have to actually understand what it is that you're dealing with. They're pointless endeavour otherwise. So this is about understanding the body corporate of which presumably you are part. And so today, where our profile will focus on buildings that are owner-occupied, dominated. That's a bit clumsy, isn't it? Owner-occupied centric.
Yeah. Yeah. Majority owner-occupied, where basically most of the people that live there are owners in the building.
So I guess this varies a lot. It varies wildly, this one. It's, I think, my experience, Frank, I don't know what yours is, but my experience would be that six-pack, you'd more likely find that owner-occupied dominated, wouldn't you? Or would you?
I suppose it depends. And this is part of the, hard and fast rules in strata are really, really hard to come by. And this is yet another example of what's a typical owner-occupied building. It can be anything. Your duplexes, your six-packs, your high-rise towers, your townhouse estates, and all those sort of things. And I suppose this is where it gets interesting, because these buildings can change over time. So what might be originally designed by the developer or the person that's building the six-pack or whatever it is as, I'm going to sell this as investment product, and they sell it through investment marketing channels and all that sort of stuff. And I'll go, you look at Pine Ridge Road, Coombabah, the vast bulk of the big schemes on that were sold through investment marketing channels back in the 90s. It was all built through those things, marketeers and all that sort of stuff. So when those buildings settled, it would have been almost 100%, not almost, was 100% investor owners. But, what are we, 30 years later, economic positions, economic circumstances change, bank policies change, government incentives changed, first home owners grants and all those sort of things. And my bet would be that the majority of those buildings are now owner occupied. So it's interesting how what might be intended at the start might not be what it finishes like. And particularly you go the last couple of years, certainly to management rights clients, the banks have been tightening the screws on investors. They've been lending to owner-occupiers. That's where the government incentives have been. So one of the problems we have with declining rental stock and rental availability is that a lot of previously investment rental property has been sold to owner-occupiers. So that's a really interesting thing that actually a client gave me yesterday. It's like, actually, I think you're right, mate. So and I suppose where I'm getting to with this is it's not necessarily what the building looks like, but the characteristics of it can change over time based on all those external things. And I suppose what we're trying to do today, well, I'll speak for me and maybe you can jump in, Chris, is trying to help people understand almost the nature of the community that you've got. Because as you say, it's sort of if you're in one of these buildings, if you're in a largely owner-occupied buildings and you've got issues or you've got concerns or you're on the committee or you want to understand what makes people tick, then today is a little bit, well, to me, a lot about that. Because to me, a lot of our, you'd call it dispute work, unfortunately, comes from owner-occupied buildings over largely investment-dominated buildings. Because, it's really, and this is back to one of those big differences in strata, it's people's homes.
Yep.
And so you get a lot more emotionally involved in a dispute about your home than you do about your investment property.
Well, I think particularly for this kind of building, because if you are an owner-occupier, then to me that suggests you've had to make some choices about how you're going to do things, whether you have purchased this as the last home that you'll live in, for example, if you're a retiree. If you have bought this, perhaps you originally intended to let it out and then crazy old COVID hit, and then you decided you could work from home forevermore, never putting pants on to attend another meeting in your life. So that changes. Or all of the things that you just spoke about, Frank. To me, a building which is largely owner-occupied is a building in which the owners have made some pretty strong choices to get to that point. That tells me that those people are probably more, I could choose my words carefully here, Frank, more invested, more engaged.
Absolutely. Yep. Care more.
Yeah, I think that's fair. There's that very loose assumption that where you've got a building where it's a lot of short-term letting, people are less engaged because they're physically less there. This is different. People who are owner-occupiers are there all the time.
People who own investment units probably have their own property that they're invested or engaged with.
Yep. That's right. And we should clarify, there's no definition of this sort of thing under strata legislation. There might be some definitions as it relates to, say, for tax purposes or something like that. When it comes to strata, though, there's no threshold at which point a building reaches, say, for example, 70% owner-occupiers. Therefore, certain things happen in that building. That's not how it works. Yeah. Well, interestingly, though, Frank, the flip side of that equation is that there are moves afoot to try and put definitions around accommodation buildings, aren't there? So
Absolutely.
We're trying to define one kind of building, but we seem less inclined to try and define another type of building, which I think is pretty problematic. Anyway, blah, blah, blah. Let's move on. The best definition I reckon that we can come up with for this conversation is that by definition, an owner-occupier scheme has fewer, well, no, let's frame that more positively, Frank. The majority of people there own and live in their lots, and the minority are investor owners. So a minority of tenants.
Yep. Absolutely. Yep. 100%. So that's probably the way to look at it. And so, and I suppose this is for people that might not be aware of what this might look like in terms of what's my body corporate, because one of the other things, I suppose, even going to the role doesn't necessarily show you whether doesn't show you whether someone's an investor or an owner-occupier. You might take something from the address. If it's care of the unit, then, that points towards them living there. If it's care of a PO box in Victoria, then it points towards an investor. But by the same token, that might be their accountant, and that's where they want their mail to go, and they got someone down there managing all their financial affairs. So it's not absolute. So there's no way to really know whether your building is literally what the percentages might be, short of door knocking. Yeah. So I think probably what we've come up with is a range of what you call indicia, I suppose, Chris, in terms of what we think predominantly owner-occupied buildings look like. And I think for me, the very first part of that is owners definitely tend to get way more involved or engaged or opinionated about what should happen with their body corporate.
And I think, and this is making a bit of a sweeping generalisation, but I think this is largely the case, there would be a tendency for owner-occupiers to, think that they have a bigger say in things, that they have more right to assert their interests.
Yes. And this I think is one of the, for a building that has a few tenants and largely owner-occupied, there is definitely what can happen. It's not really segregation. It's not apartheid. They're very strong words, and obviously that's not what this is. But there definitely can be a differential sort of class system in people's minds, particularly owner-occupiers, about those bloody tenants.
Look, Frank, I don't. Sometimes it's never that obvious, but you can tell from the mindset and you can tell from the language. I was talking to a client very recently, committee, and the discussion veered into occupiers and tenants, and it became apparent to me by the way they were talking about tenants that they did not regard tenants in quite the same way that they regarded owner-occupiers at that scheme. Oddly enough, that scheme was vast majority was tenanted, but hey, whatever. There you go.
And that's that legislative thing too. From a legal perspective, as close as we get to definitions, is everyone who lives in a building is an occupier, but only some people might be owners.
That's right. So I think then we get to the next point, which is that there will be that tension between those who are owner-occupiers and those who are investor owners. And Frank, you've got a little anecdote to share about that.
I do. Had the joy of renovating a house a few years ago. We had to move out, so before construction costs went through the roof. So in hindsight, it was a good decision. At the time, it didn't feel like a good decision. But anyway, moved into a new unit off the plan, not to buy with renters, which is fine. The manager set up a Facebook page and opened it up to everyone. So this is the building's Facebook page. Go for it. Within 3 days, she'd resigned as the moderator and left because everyone was blown up about a whole range of things. But one of the things that really came out loud and clear to me when I was on Facebook, which I'm not anymore, thank goodness, was someone, an owner-occupier, something got stolen from the gym. Like someone pulled out a TV, one of the TVs you watch while you're doing gym work. So it got stolen. And owner-occupier posted, who was the moderator for this thing or whatever it is, TV's got stolen, must have been a tenant. Can everyone please keep the eye out? And it's just at that stage, everyone in the building who was a tenant blew up, and everyone as an owner-occupier got a little bit defensive and pushed back. And there was this massive argument about why do you think because we're tenants, we're thieves? It went on. I think I turned off at about 130 comments. But that happens.
It does, unfortunately. It does. Some of the other indicia, because people are living there on site, I think we agree, Frank, that there's probably going to be a higher degree of monitoring for bylaw breaches or alleged bylaw breaches. It kind of just makes sense. Not necessarily saying it's a good thing, saying it makes sense just from a practical perspective. When it comes to meetings, I think there are some particular features. I think you can probably assume that there's going to be greater engagement in meetings, greater voter turnout, I would suggest. Frank, would you agree?
Committee nominations, absolutely, and more potential factions.
Yep.
We've done webinars on factions before, so this is where you see them more than other types of buildings in largely owner-occupied ones.
We might also see more in-person meetings as opposed to virtual meetings because everyone's there. So, meetings in the common area, meetings in the gym. I've had meetings in gyms, meetings in the functions room, all of that sort of stuff. You also probably, I think, Frank, it stands to reason you'll have greater engagement in things like working bees, forums, social events.
Absolutely. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. No, I just had a phone call pop up and it's cancelled it. Yeah, absolutely. And that's probably that sense of community is probably a little bit more there where owner-occupiers create it. And don't get me wrong, I mean, that can still happen in, tenants renters can still drive that type of community, but sometimes they're not necessarily as motivated to.
That's right.
On the people, it's always led from the top.
I reckon, Frank, that the owner-occupied building, the building which has the majority of owners as owner-occupiers, I actually think that's what the legislation was always intended to try and account for, largely. So way back in the sands of time, and you'd know a little bit more, not a little bit, a lot more about that than me. I'm not that I'm saying that you're old or anything, just you've had more experience. But to me, that's where Queensland's legislation started anyway, that idea of an owner-occupied building.
Yep, I'd agree.
Yep. So with that in mind, then what does the legislation actually say about that? Well, not very much, actually. There's no particular provision, so we don't have a module for owner-occupied buildings. It'd be interesting to see what one of those would look like, actually. I think I know what one of the first things it would include. It would include the ability to prohibit short-term letting, I would imagine, as well as perhaps some ability to vet tenants, stuff like that. But none of that currently exists. So just to clarify, none of that currently exists. As you said before, Frank, everyone's an occupier, but some people are owners too.
Yes, so we're a dual hat sort of thing. So, and I don't know whether that's a little bit Orwellian in the sense of 4 legs good, 2 legs better type stuff, but everyone can make their own decisions on that.
They can. So the problems then, what are the issues that arise? Well, I think one of the biggest ones is that fundamental tension between an owner-occupier and an owner-investor. The motivations of the two are not the same in a lot of cases. And when it comes to finances, Frank, I think that's particularly where those differences get exacerbated, don't they?
Absolutely. In terms of spending, what do we want to do to improve things or paint things? And we're back to that statutory obligation to keep the common property in sort of good repair and condition. Good repair can be a little bit subjective. You can certainly leave things go a little bit longer in some circumstances other than others. And then there's also wholesale changes. We're going to go and do a whole building renovation project to reframe the porte cochere and redo the pool and redo all the gardens and grounds. From an investor's perspective, particularly in a market where rents are probably increasing, why do I want to spend the money? From an owner-occupier's perspective, that's their home. They want to improve it. So that absolutely is a source of tension.
That's right. And then there can be a sense that decisions are being made or should be made in favour of owner-occupiers to the detriment of investors. Yeah.
And that comes back to that committee control, because again, and then even you'd say across the board, and there's absolutely no data at all to back this up. So I'm going to go completely off the grid, Chris, and say that the majority of committees would be full of people that reside in the buildings that they are the committee member for. I'd say investor owners are less likely to get involved in the committee. So when it comes to decisions in bodies corporate and that sort of stuff, they're largely owner-occupied led.
I'd largely agree with you, Frank. I think that's largely, gosh, we're saying that word a lot, the case. It kind of then follows, doesn't it, that one of your next problems would be that power struggle which occurs in a building where the split between owner-occupiers and investors is more towards 50-50. Now, let's be clear, that could actually work out to be a great building because, everyone is challenged in a constructive way to get things moving, but where there is real deadlock on say, ideological concerns, that would be a problematic building.
Yeah, and I mean, there's no, I suppose, proportionate representation requirements under the Act either in terms of different classes of owner, for want of a better phrase, investor owners, lockups, owner-occupiers, that sort of stuff. It's just people that put their hand up. So you'd look at our federal system where we've got sort of a state with individual seats, and then we've got 12 senators, say for Queensland, that are elected across the entire state. No such thing in Strata. I suppose there's not necessarily as many applicants for the roles as what there might be for politics. But those sort of, I suppose, that differential interest can cause friction.
Absolutely. One of the other kind of concerns that arises is a distrust of legitimate things such as letting. whether it be short-term or long-term. We've discussed many times in this forum about how occupiers can be great for a strata scheme, but in an owner-occupier dominated scheme, that distrust might actually become quite significant. And then that kind of flows, Frank, doesn't it, into the idea that if there are tenants on site, that there needs to be some very different focus on regulating their conduct as opposed to owner conduct.
Absolutely. And I mean, that's, you say permanent tenants on the one part, and then if you want to go the next leg and say that someone short-term rents their unit when everyone else is living in there full-time by Airbnb or otherwise, that causes so much carnage, it's not funny. And I mean, we spoke earlier about what's causing rental demand in Queensland. Maybe the owner-occupier is buying what was previously rental stock is one part of it. The other part of it is absolutely people short-term renting units that used to be permanently let. And what I'd say is, councils, talking about dobbing your neighbour and let us know so we can charge them more rates. That's actually not going to fix the problem.
No.
It's about changing the town plan and enforcing it.
It's a window dressing solution. And then we've got situations where we have a building which is dominated by owner-occupiers, but they have a management rights holder, Frank. That poses its own colourful set of circumstances, doesn't it?
It does. And, if we're going to make some wide sweeping generalisations, you'd say an owner-occupied committee with a management rights agreement that they're not happy with, and perhaps a manager that might not be performing well, or everyone not understanding what their roles are, is also a source of substantial dispute that we get. And again, you'd say from a management rights perspective, if they've got the majority of owners in their investment pool that are renters, that they're managing, and the owners are getting their rent, that's what most investors want. Owner-occupiers want different things. So, and this absolutely happens a lot, is there's accusations around managers sort of creating voting blocks and getting all of their investor owners to vote in favour of things that the manager wants, which then goes against what the owner-occupied committee might want, and all that sort of stuff. And again, that's back to factions, and more than anything else, that's back to motivating people to vote. So again, another big difference between strata and our political system is that voting from an election perspective, the government is compulsory, voting in strata isn't. So more often than not, the person that wins a contested ballot is the one that can actually convince people to tick a box, or even now press a button if the body corporate's gone with electronic voting. That's right. So there is some of that, and the government has seen that where they've created certain things that must be by secret ballot. For example, topping up a management rights agreement, a new management rights agreement, committee elections, Chris, where those things must be secret ballot, which means that the identity of anyone voting is available. So you see that Frank's voted, but you don't know which way he's voted by virtue of the process. So, I don't necessarily give that much credit in a sense, but it's just back to the usual, what we get in terms of disputes and why people ring us is I'm not getting my way.
Yep. Absolutely. And probably one final one that it's worth just mentioning is that there might be some tendency for things in owner-occupied buildings to just get a little stale, a little stymied, not as much motivation to change or improve. In some cases, that's fine. In other cases, like say if the building is in an area which wasn't maybe historically a tourist area and then becomes a tourist area or a hipster area, you can see how you can see that, can't you? How that will become a problem. And then you've also got a situation where you might have a building that quite legitimately wants to terminate and redevelop. But the motivations of owner-occupiers versus the motivations of owner-investors would be very different under those circumstances. And you could see how a building dominated by owner-occupiers might change that outcome really significantly.
And we might have some legislative intervention on that in some stage, because it's the very first thing we discussed at the Community Titles Legislation Working Group, wasn't it?
We may.
Housing buildings.
Yes, we may.
And that's nothing other than we've discussed it. In terms of what the government does, ladies and gentlemen, we have no idea. But
No idea. So look, all of that in the couple of minutes that we got left, then what would we offer to people? Well, I think the first thing is just to clarify, we don't think owner-occupier buildings are terrible. We're not saying that at all. It's just highlighting some of the quirks. If there is a problem in an owner-occupier dominated building, then the chances are that that is a mindset issue. And a mindset that really, in my view, you might have a different one, Frank, but in my view, the only way that you address a mindset issue is by some kind of communication process, some kind of strategy around communication which goes towards changing, or at the very least influencing, that mindset.
And I'd say probably the other thing, from a committee perspective for an owner-occupied building, is make sure that you're representative of all owners' interests, not just the owner-occupiers, because that's that, I say tenant victimisation, and that's not the quite thing, but they're quite the right word. But, I still come back to, one of my very, very first commissioners applications. Like, this is, crikey, I just come back from London. Must have been 1999, last century. So I don't do these things at all, but this new fandangled commissioner's office, no one knew what it was. Here, Frank, have a go at this. And it was about, what we were doing is we were acting for a body corporate who was chopping up, typical Frank vernacular, accusing someone of breaching the bylaws by creating a garden out the front of their lot on common property. So this is one, Chris, when the adjudicator actually came down from Brisbane to have a look. So they truly used their investigative powers. They came along and went and had a look around the body corporate. And we got absolutely smoked, because the first thing the adjudicator saw was these gardens around the front of everyone else's houses, including the committees, on common property. So what was happening is we as the committee just didn't like that one or that person, and we were smashing them up. So first rule of this Fight Club, and I think this applies particularly to every committee, is make sure that whatever you're doing, it's consistent across the board with the entire community. Yeah. Because when you get these largely, when there's one particular faction or one particular style of owner that dominates a committee, sometimes they can turn the scope onto the others and make life a little bit harder for them for whatever reason. So if you are there, being consistent, being reasonable, and just stepping back and not being so emotionally involved at a committee level is a really important thing.
Well said, Frank. That's a really great point on which to sort of end the discussion of owner-occupier dominated buildings. I get the idea, everyone listening in, that this is all about creating an idea of understanding of the building in which you have some stake in, and then how you manage things from that point. It's always a little different building to building, and stay tuned for the rest of the series. There's plenty of them in this series, funnily enough. That's all the time we have for this week. You can find all the notes and links that we've mentioned at hineslegal.com.au. You can find me at stratasolve.com.au. And you can find Frank Higginson at hineslegal.com.au. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Frank.
Thanks, Chris, as always.